All right, good morning, guys. Welcome to the team. Let's get started. Go ahead and get your coffee, donuts, find your seat. Well, as we all know, the big day is finally here. How many of you are going to go to a Super Bowl party and watch the game with friends? How many of you are going to just be at home and watch it in your own house? Yeah, that's kind of the movement. I'm more that way myself. I like to critique the commercials all to myself. I like to fall asleep somewhere during the second quarter and then wake up at the end. I have a question on the screen. I just get curious about this kind of stuff. Oh, no. Go back to that one, yeah. How many chicken wings will be consumed on Super Bowl Sunday? I've already talked to one guy who actually knows the answer to this, but just give me a guess. How many chicken? Yeah, people have seen that, right? 1.3 billion chicken wings on Super Bowl Sunday alone. That's actually according to a group called the National Chicken Council. Did you know that group existed in America? It just struck me as funny. I mean, what would you, if that was your job, and your kid says, "Hey, Daddy, what do you do?" I work for the National Chicken Council. It just sounds funny to me. If that's your job, I totally respect what you do. They release an annual wing report, and they estimated 1.3 billion. That's 162.5 million pounds. That's enough for every man, woman, and child in America to eat 4 chicken wings. How many are you going to do your part? So somebody said how many, what was it, Jeff? How much beer? Was it 1.3 billion gallons? Dollars worth of beer. $1.3 billion worth of beer on one day. I won't ask how many are doing your share there. And there was also in chips, it was like millions and millions of pounds of chips. So those are really interesting. I like those little factoids. They're interesting. All right. So we'll probably see more of those come Sunday and all that. A tourist in Singapore walked into an exotic pet shop and was looking at the animals on display. You know, snakes, monkeys, baby tigers, that sort of thing. While he was there, another customer walked in and said to the shopkeeper, "I'll have a sea monkey, please." The shopkeeper nodded, went to a cage at the side of the shop, took out a monkey. He fit the monkey with a collar and a leash and handed it to the customer, saying, "That'll be $5,000. Customer paid and walked out with his monkey. The tourist was surprised, went over to the shopkeeper and said, "I noticed that most of the monkeys are only a few $100s, but that one was $5,000. Why was it so expensive?" Shopkeeper said, "Well, that's a sea monkey. That's a computer monkey. That means it can write basic computer code. He's fast, does tight code, no bugs, well worth the money." The tourist looked at the monkey in another cage, and it was wearing a price tag on its collar. And that one, he said, "That one's $10,000. What does that one do?" Shopkeeper said, "Oh, that one's more advanced. It can manage object-oriented programming, visual graphics, even in Java. Pretty cool stuff." The tourist looked around a little longer and saw a third monkey had a cage all to itself. Price tag around its neck read $50,000. He couldn't believe it. He says, "That one costs more than all the other monkeys put together. What on earth does it do?" Shopkeeper said, "Well, I haven't actually seen it do anything yet, but it says it's a consultant." Now, just so you know, if you're a consultant, and we've actually worked with some really good consultants here at church, this joke, it struck me, works the same way if you say, "Well, I actually haven't seen it do anything, but it says it's a pastor." It works the same way for that. All right. We are going to look at a clip today. We're in week 18 of the season, and we're looking at Peter today and the turning points in his life, and I'm calling it 3 Strikes and You're, because we'll finish the story later. But I'm going to look at a clip today, again, out of Franco Zeffirelli's classic made-for-TV series, Jesus of Nazareth. I have it on DVD, and you can find all the scenes and stuff. Still one of the better portrayals of the whole gospel story. But in the clip we're going to see, Jesus has already been betrayed by Judas. We're going to look at Judas' story next week, I believe. He's been betrayed in the garden by Judas, where he'd been praying. Most of the disciples scatter, but Peter has followed sort of this mob scene at a distance because he knows something's bad happening. He's not sure what to do about it. Jesus is dragged into a secret midnight meeting of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, and he's tried there, and he's condemned of the crime of blasphemy, which in Jewish culture was punishable by death. But because the Jews at that time didn't have the authority to execute because they were being ruled by the Romans, only the Romans could do that, then they send Jesus off to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, which is right according to the biblical story. So this scene starts with Peter sort of hanging around outside the high priest's palace, and he sees Jesus being led away, and then Peter is confronted by several people who recognize him, and this sets up the scene we're going to read today. So let's roll the clip.
Let him be taken before the procurator Pontius Pilate, in whose hands lies the final authority for trial and judgment.
Son of God! Kill him! Stone him! Blasphemer!
Well, what happened to him?
They're sending him to Pontius Pilate.
We know how that'll end up, don't we? Wait a minute. I know you. You were with that Jesus. You're one of his followers.
No, I don't know him.
But he is. Look!
And I know him. He is one of his followers. Yes, I've seen him. I've seen him. No!
Catch him!
He's a liar! Arrest him! I tell you, I don't know him!
He was with him, I saw him.
Please! What's going on here?
He's a friend of Jesus, a disciple. Don't let him go.
Oh, please. Mistaken. I neither know this Jesus they speak of, nor have I ever heard of him.
Go! Just keep quiet here. Don't you know you're on sacred ground?
All right, having seen the scene which some of you are familiar with, let's jump into the scripture here. We have several passages taken from several of the Gospels. We'll piece them together today and tell Peter's story. In Matthew 26, we read, "Then Jesus told them," and this is at the night of the Last Supper. This is the night all this happens, but right beforehand, they're having dinner together. Jesus told them, meaning his disciples, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter replied, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the other disciples said the same. We'll pause there. We'll come back to the story in a minute. The first thing I think we see in this part of Peter's story is what I'm calling an immature boast. An immature boast. When I was about 5 years old or so, and I can't remember if I've told this story at Team before, maybe years ago, but I was about 5 years old. Our family lived in Louisville, Kentucky. And one of my favorite TV shows as a little boy, and I have just foggy memories of this, one of my favorite TV shows that I think was on at 4 o'clock every day, and I've gone back in the internet and looked it up because it did exist, was a show called T-Bar V Ranch. It was a cowboy-themed show, and I have pictures of me at that age. I had my little holster, my gun, my little guns. I had my cowboy hat. I had the whole deal, like chaps and stuff. That it was really funny, but it was a big deal then, cowboys and Indians, So I had my cowboy stuff, and I'd watch T-Bar V Ranch. Somehow my parents managed to take me to a filming of a show, into the live audience, like going to Oprah or something. But we went to T-Bar V Ranch. I had no idea how it all put together, but somehow, I think it was by random, I got called up to be one of the kids that got to go on stage to be interviewed by the star of the show, which was a guy named Randy Atcher, who was a country music guy who became the star of this little local Louisville cowboy show, Cowboy Randy. And all I remember was sitting on this stool. There's lights everywhere. I'm on this stool. I'm 5 years old or so. And time comes, he's actually going to talk to me. And this is like my cowboy hero. I'm sitting on the show. There's all these people out there. And he asked me my name and I must have told him. And then he asked me a question I didn't have any idea what he's going to ask. I'm 5. He says, "So, little Brian, have you ever been fishing?" Now, at that point in time, I'd never fished my whole life. I didn't know what fishing was. But somehow at the time, under that pressure, with Cowboy Randy, no didn't seem like the right answer. It just seemed that would be embarrassing. So I went, "Yes." Right in front of my family and everybody watching, I lied. I said, "Yes." Then he said, "Did you catch anything?" And I don't even know the name of a fish. I don't know any kind of fish other than what you eat at a fish fillet, McDonald's. I don't know. And so I said, "Yes." And this is what I said, literally. I said, "And I caught a shark this big." Only kind of fish I could think of, a shark. And I have no idea if he laughed, or my family's probably deeply embarrassed because that was my one chance, on TV. Yep, that's what I said. Well, from the stories we have in the Gospels, we start to get a picture of Peter and his personality. Peter is just a fascinating, lovable character, and I think if he came into this room, he would fit right in with the guys. He's been a fisherman his whole life, which would mean he's a working man. He wasn't on track to become a scholar in that culture. Somewhere he just was going to learn a trade, probably his father's trade. So he's a working man. Made his living by the sweat of his back, by his strength, by his hands, mending nets. No one gave him anything, and he didn't ask for anything. If he didn't catch fish, he didn't eat. So he worked hard, just a hard-working man. We also get the sense, as you read the story, that Peter had kind of a big personality. I think of I'm trying to think of people in our culture. I was thinking like a John Goodman character in a movie, kind of a big, blustery, bigger-than-life kind of personality. He was loud, somewhat impulsive, the kind of guy who would take action for really thinking things through. Also fiercely loyal, the kind of guy you wanted to have your back if you got into an altercation or a street fight. You wanted Peter on your side. In fact, he was one of the first to leave his fishing boat and follow Jesus. Andrew, his younger brother, was the first one. Andrew went and got Peter right away, and Peter left his boat and followed Jesus. When he saw Jesus walking on the water in that great story, he wants to do it too, so he jumps out of the boat and starts doing it, then he almost drowns because his faith falters. But he's the one that got out of the boat. Tells you something about his personality. In this story, when Jesus warns that hard times are coming, when he warns all the disciples that they're going to fall away, that they don't know what's going to happen, and he was warning all of them, Peter just blurts out. He just blurts out, not me, I'm never going to deny. I'm never going to do that. I'll die first before I turn into that guy. So Peter was a proud man. He thought of himself as rough and tough and courageous, a fighter, a loyal friend. And actually, when Jesus was arrested in the garden, and we read in one of the Gospels, it was Peter who was the one ready to fight. When all the soldiers showed up, he pulled out his fisherman's knife, whatever he had strapped to his leg under his cloak, and he wanted to fight all of them by himself. He swung at the high priest's servant, cut his ear off right there, until Jesus told him to put away the sword. So he was backing up his words, ready to fight. So you kind of have to love Peter, because his heart's in the right place. He wants to do what's right. But he often talks before he really thinks things through. And then, Scripture says, and then we saw it in the movie, his moment of trial comes. And he doesn't see it coming, he doesn't expect it, and he's not prepared, and he has 3 chances. That's the second part of our outline today, 3 chances. Whenever I read this story, I think of something that happened to me, and I'm sure some of you may remember this story, but it was many years ago, and it was right after I'd gotten my very first job in ministry. I was working part-time. I was in my late 20s, working part-time at a church in Glen Ellen as a part-time youth pastor, and I was in seminary at Northern Baptist Seminary in Lombard. So the role was new to me. I had never had that title before as pastor. I was living in Wheaton, Illinois, in a big house with 4 other guys who were also in seminary or graduate students. And I needed a haircut. Lived in a new community. I'd never lived in this area before. Came up from Indiana. And so I stopped at a random barbershop, saw the old-fashioned pole outside, and went into the barbershop. Within a couple of minutes after sitting down, I realized I'd walked into a really old-fashioned barbershop. This would be back in the 80s. Because I kind of looked around, and first of all, the language, it sounded a little bit like the barbershop in Gran Torino, if you remember that scene. The language was pretty rough. It was just what you did in that barbershop, evidently, the way they talked to each other. So I was sitting there listening, and then I looked around, and there were stacks of magazines on the tables, but they weren't Sports Illustrateds. if you know what I mean. They were men's magazines, and there are a lot of them. And so right away, I felt really uncomfortable. Like, shouldn't have come in. This is not the right barbershop for me. I really don't want to be here. But to get up and leave seemed really awkward, because it just would have been awkward. So I thought, okay, I'll get my haircut, stick it out, and that'll be at the end of it. So my turn comes, I get in the barbershop chair, old-fashioned chair, and the guy goes, "So, you must be new around here. Haven't seen you before." Yeah, I am. Next question is, "So, what do you do?" And I'm thinking, well, if I say I'm a youth pastor in a church and a seminary student, this whole conversation is going to get really weird. And I really wasn't prepared to go there. I just wanted a haircut and wanted to leave. And so I had to answer quickly, so I said, I'm a teacher, which was kind of true. I was teaching young people about faith and those kinds of things, but it avoided the whole conversation, the whole spiritual conversation. And then the guy changed the conversation, left me alone, cut my hair, and I left. Later, it dawned on me that I hadn't just avoided the conversation, I had avoided the chance to identify with Jesus around whom my whole life was oriented. And I missed it. I was chicken. I chickened out. Continue the story, John chapter 18. Simon Peter and another disciple, who was probably John, that's the way John refers to himself in his own writing, the other disciple. John and Peter did a lot of things together where they were pretty close friends, were following Jesus. So they're following at a distance, the mob, they're taking him to be interrogated. Because this disciple, John, was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. So here's the situation. Jesus has been arrested. All the disciples scatter. They're afraid. They don't know what's going to happen next. They don't know what's happening to Jesus. But Peter, and likely John, follow the mob, and they want to see what's happening to their friend. Jesus is taken from the Garden of Gethsemane, which is just on one edge of Jerusalem across a little stream. I'll talk more about that in a second. And he's dragged up a hill. It's only about maybe not even half a mile, a quarter of a mile, third of a mile, up to what was called Caiaphas' palace. Caiaphas was the high priest. And he's being interrogated or interviewed there. Now, let me take a side trip here, because this is just an interesting part of the story. A couple of years ago, my wife and I and Jeff and his wife were able to go to the Holy Land. And one of the more interesting things, lots of interesting things there if you've ever been, but one of the most interesting things we saw there was the ruins of Caiaphas' palace in Jerusalem. Because you can actually today make the same walk on the same street that they would have dragged Jesus from the Garden of Gethsemane up to be interviewed at Caiaphas' palace. And in Caiaphas' palace, it's been unearthed enough now, and they discovered a really interesting construction in this palace. That's why they're pretty sure this is the place where Caiaphas was. This is the place where Jesus was interrogated. Because what they found was in the upper floor of this home or building is kind of an office complex. And then in the middle of the floor, there's a hole cut into the floor, and it's a shaft that goes down to the middle floor, which is kind of an area of holding cells, and then through that all the way into the lowest floor, which is one single cell, dungeon, carved out of rock. So then they take you down to that lower cell, and you can actually walk down in there, and it's carved out of rock. It's like 8 feet wide, 8 feet by 8 feet, big, just about the size of like a lower level bathroom, and it's about 12 feet tall. It's carved sheer stone, nothing else, just stone. And you look up, and the shaft hole is in the ceiling, and it goes all the way up through the middle floors, all the way up into the office complex above the shaft. And scholars now think it's the only building like that they found in all of Jerusalem that has this shaft in it. It's weird. It's a hole right in the middle of the floor, goes all the way down. Now they think they know what it was used for. They think it was used so that the high priest could interrogate a prisoner in that lowest dungeon to find out what his crime was. Because if that crime was murder, for example, the high priest couldn't be in the presence of a murderer because it would make the high priest unclean according to Jewish law. And so he couldn't take that risk because that meant he had to go through like a week of purification before he could do anything else. So this is right before Passover. So when Jesus was brought in to be interrogated, they put him in that dungeon, and the high priest asked questions down the shaft to determine whether he could be brought into his presence or not, and then they brought him up for the rest of the interrogation. That's the theory of this room. So we were able to stand in that dungeon, which if that's true, if that's Caiaphas' house, that's almost 100% certainty that Jesus stood right there 2,000 years ago and was being interrogated by a man already bent on killing him to find out if he was clean or unclean. It was moving for two reasons. First of all, Jesus had been there by himself in this dungeon. Secondly, it's backward, isn't it? So this high priest is interrogating Jesus, who we believe to be the Son of God, without sin, who was going to give himself to make the whole world clean from their sin. He's being interrogated, and it should be the other way around. He should be the one up there interrogating us, but he put himself in the dungeon. An incredibly moving experience to be there. But this is where they are in Caiaphas' palace. We know from other parts of Scripture that plans were already in place by the powers of the religious authority to do away with Jesus. They wanted him dead. So it takes at least some courage for Peter to go this far. There's only 2 disciples that track this far. The rest of them are scattered. So it takes at least some courage to be there. It's the middle of the night. Peter's in a small courtyard outside the high priest complex, and someone makes a small fire. So Peter's warming himself by the fire, trying to figure out what's happening, what to do next, and someone recognizes him. Verse 17, "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they'd made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Jumping ahead to verse 25. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there, warming himself, so they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it. One of the other Gospels says he denied it with an oath. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Now, several things about the story. First of all, as we've said all year long, the Bible doesn't hide the flaws of its heroes. This is Peter, the man who in a few weeks would preach the very first open-air Christian sermon on the stairways of the temple on the day of Pentecost when the Holy Spirit arrived on the disciples. This is Peter. Peter, who has 2 books in the New Testament named after him, which are letters that he wrote in the first century. This is Peter, who would eventually become one of the pillars of the church, both in Jerusalem and Rome, who tradition tells us was crucified upside down under the reign of Nero because he said he was unworthy to die in the same manner of his Lord. This is Peter, who some scholars believe stands at the very gateway of heaven. This is Peter, okay? This is Peter who swings and misses 3 times. He's got 3 opportunities to stick up for his master, his Lord, 3 opportunities to proclaim his allegiance, and he fails all 3 times. Now, this could be the turning point of his life, right? This could be the turning point of his life. Could be a signature failure that he never recovers from. It's such a human story. If we put ourselves in Peter's shoes, I think we can understand. It's a dangerous night. There are Roman soldiers involved. You don't mess around with those guys. They were trained to kill. High priest had a lot of power. Peter's afraid. He's surprised. He doesn't see it coming. And so he does the best he can. He denies. And then when he hears the rooster, he's filled with shame. Here's a question I always have when I read this story. How do we even have this story in our Bibles? There's only 2 options. Either John, the other disciple, witnesses all this and tells it later, or more likely, because at some point John is not mentioned in this story, they got separated. I think it's much more likely that Peter, later in his life, shared the story. That he chose to share his greatest failure so that we would understand what that's like. But his failure isn't the end. Part 3 today is the rest of the story, like Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. After Jesus' death and resurrection, Peter makes the decision to go back fishing. We find this in John's gospel. And I'm going to read a portion of scripture today that's not in your notes. He goes back to fishing, another turning point in his life. He gives up the whole follow Jesus thing, goes back to what he knows best. He's a fisherman after all. So he goes back to his boat. He says, let's go fishing again. Got to make a living. That Jesus is gone, even though he rose from the dead. And though he's alive, he's gone. Ministry days are over. It's the only thing he knows how to do. So they're fishing all night. Toward the morning, they've caught nothing. Toward morning, someone calls to them from the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Says, catch anything? Have you any fish? And they say, not a thing. And then the voice says, try the other side of the boat. And they immediately know who it is, because this is the second time this has happened to them. First time was when Jesus was actually fishing with them. He says, try the other side of the boat. They throw it out. They catch a whole bunch of fish. Peter recognizes who's on the shore. He jumps out of the boat again. This is Peter, after all. He doesn't wait to row the boat in. He just jumps out of the boat and swims to shore to be the first one to see Jesus, which he does. When he gets on the shore, John says, you can find the story in John chapter 21. It's a beautiful story. Jesus has already built a little charcoal fire. And the word the Bible uses for charcoal fire only happens twice in the New Testament. And it's a word used here, and it was used at the site of Peter's denials when he was standing warming himself at a fire. The same word. It's only used twice in the whole Bible, there and here. All right? Jesus is grilling fish for breakfast, waiting for his friends to come in, which is another really human story. You don't think of Jesus that way, but he's there grilling fish for the guys. John 21, it's not in your notes. Let me read this part of the story. Verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Most scholars think he's gesturing at the boat and the nets because he'd gone back to fishing. Do you love me more than your other life, your former life? Yes, Lord. He said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Now that's a reference. It sounds odd to us, but that's a reference to a shepherd. That's what a shepherd does. And a shepherd is the New Testament word for pastor. Okay? Feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Now I think this might be one of the most beautiful stories in all the Bible, particularly for us as men. It's as if Jesus has intentionally recreated the scene of Peter's greatest failure. He's got a small charcoal fire. He's waiting for Peter, and he asks him this question. But instead of grilling him about his failure, which I would understand, you'd kind of think Jesus might go, okay, here's the fire. Remember last time you had a fire like this? What happened, Peter? What happened? What'd you say? What'd you do? How could you? That'd be grilling him about his failure. But Jesus doesn't. Instead of confronting him or shaming him for denying him 3 times, he just gives him 3 chances to reaffirm his love, to reaffirm his relationship. Do you love me more than these? Do you love me? Do you love me? Just the question itself cuts to Peter's heart. But notice, all 3 times Jesus says, then feed my lambs, take care of my sheep. That's trust. He's trusting Peter to care for the early church, which would become the early church, as all his other followers after Jesus is gone. It's trust. And then he says, follow me. It's the second time he said to Peter, follow me. Once was when he was first in his boat, and this is after his denials. See, I think this is the turning point of Peter's life. Not his failures, okay? Not his going back to fishing. This is the turning point of his life. Peter finds out that even his worst failure does not disqualify him from the love and forgiveness of Christ. Even his worst failure does not disqualify him from following Jesus. And Jesus then trusts him, calls him to feed his lambs, to be a leader in the early church. Now, this story is typically called the reinstatement of Peter, and it's a picture of the grace and forgiveness of Christ. It's a picture of the gospel. But I think we are all, in a way, like Peter. More or less. We're all in a way like Peter. We all fail. We all swing and miss. Probably on a daily basis, I would think. But Jesus comes to us the same way. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Follow me. Our failures don't disqualify us from following him because of who he is. Here's the questions I want you to have around the table today. First, can you remember making a boast you couldn't back up? Maybe as a younger man, maybe as a 5-year-old. Can you remember being a little overconfident in some area of your life? Maybe you have a story like that. Second, this is a similar question we asked last week, but have you ever faced a situation where you felt hesitant or afraid to admit your faith in Jesus or to call him by name? Explain that. That's similar to last week. Have you ever followed in secret, like Nicodemus met with him in secret? But maybe you have a barbershop story of your own to tell. In verse 3, if you put yourself in Peter's shoes, how would it have felt to have Jesus give you a second chance? Maybe you can contemporize that. How does it feel to you now, knowing he'll give you a second chance? So get some coffee, donut, wrap you up right before 7 o'clock.